Hello, welcome to today's lesson. Today we will be learning about George Washington. Specifically, we'll be reading the article Growing Up in Colonial Virginia. So, as we read this article, we are going to be discussing the beginnings of George Washington. George Washington had a beginning like you and me. We all had to start somewhere. So today's article that we're going to read is really going to delve into his beginnings and talk about many other important things. In this text, it is going to be discussing the influential things and events that happened in George Washington's life before he became our president. So, before we begin reading, we might want to start thinking about what we already know about George Washington. Most of you will know that he was the first president of the United States. You might also be familiar with the myth about how he chopped down a cherry tree. Now, for those of you who do not recognize this myth, it's simple. The legend has it that when George Washington was 6, he received a hatchet and he chopped down his father's cherry tree. And upon his father's questioning about it, his response was, "I cannot tell a lie, Father. I did chop down your cherry tree." And his father responded, "My son's honesty is much more valuable than 1,000 cherry trees," or something along the lines of that. His honesty was much more valued than the cherry trees. And then another thing that you might already know about George Washington is that the common belief is that he never told a lie, that he was a very honest man. And you can see how that plays into that legend about the cherry tree. Before we begin our reading of this text, we are just going to briefly look at what the text is going to teach us. Now, this will help us be familiar with the things that we're going to read, be familiar with the structure of the text, and also just really connect your background information into the text that we're going to read, because this might be unfamiliar to some of you. So this article starts with just kind of tackling these myths or legends that we've already discussed, that you might have already heard. It addresses them, and then after that it discusses the beginnings of George Washington. It explains how he was born into modest wealth in Colonial Virginia, and how this will end up playing a bigger role down the line in his life. George Washington was born in 1732 to a family in Virginia that had a pretty modest wealth. They did, in fact, have about 20 slaves on their property, which is a sign of wealth during this time. The text moves on to talk about important factors of George Washington's life. When George was 11, his father passed away, and he ended up moving in with his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, who would become more like a surrogate father to him. Lawrence's relationship and his experience in the American Regiment of the British Army would really influence George's decisions in his life and would really come to inspire him. And then another important impact or influence on young George would be that of George William Fairfax, who was a wealthy lord from Virginia, who came to visit and was so impressed by George's horseback skills that he would include him on their travels down west. Now, as you read the text, it's important to remember, and it's going to be important to think back on these things, because we're going to be learning about how George William Fairfax and his travels out west would come to influence the life of George as he grew older, and just a lot of things that would happen prior to becoming president. And then the text will also discuss how by the age of 20, George had suffered the death of both his real and surrogate fathers. His brother Lawrence would come to die in 1752, and George would become the owner and recipient of Mount Vernon, the estate that Lawrence had. And then this would play a big role in George securing a public office. Through this inheritance of Mount Vernon, George was managed to win the title of major in the Virginia militia that had been previously held by Lawrence. So, as we move on to reading, which is what's going to happen next after we're done with this portion of class, you guys are going to move on to independent reading, and then we are going to come back together and discuss what we have learned, how this brief discussion of the text helped with your understanding, helped with understanding the structure. And then as we look ahead, we're going to really want to remember these factors as we move on to the next section of George Washington's life.